Welcome, everyone from around the US and actually from around the world. For some of you, this is a good evening. For some of you, it's a good afternoon. And even for a few of you, it's a good morning. I'm Susan Lauer, Administrator of the Maharishi Vastu Office for North America. Jon Lipman, our National Director for Maharishi Vastu and Chief Vastu Architect here in the US, will be discussing our topic for the event, Why is East Important? Jon will also be elaborating throughout the discussion the scientific research that demonstrates the importance of orientation to the East and the positive outcomes of that orientation. So Jon, would you like to get started now?
Yes, thank you very much, Susan. It's great to be with you again, and I'm looking forward to this session in which we're going to go deeply into what some of the reasons are, what some of the causes are for the major effects of Vastu. And I'm going to rely on quite a bit of visual aids, and so I'm just going to share my screen with you, and I will at that point be just a small square up in the corner, and you won't miss me, I'm sure. So what are the effects of Vastu, and how can we understand the causes? Maharishi has said, based on the scriptural references, the Vedic literature, that the effects of living in Vastu properly executed is to have a nourishing effect upon our health, to promote happiness, to promote family harmony, to increase the influence of success in our lives, and finally, growth towards enlightenment. Well, how is it that a building, which we normally think of as being inert, can possibly have such effects upon us? And we do not mean as a placebo, as a matter of belief, but through the functioning of real laws of nature. Well, that's what we're going to look at today. Here's a photograph of me in front of my own Vastu home. Susan and I and the others of us who live in Vastu get such pleasure from our own homes. They have such intense, blissful effects upon us, and they are in each of these 5 areas. And so what I'm talking about is not something abstract or theoretical to me and to Susan, but something which is real, which we experience. So what are the rules? Well, Vastu is much, I will talk about the rules, but Vastu is much more than a set of specific rules. It integrates the house into nature truly on the deepest level, so that the walls of the house do not block the flow of our own consciousness. Well, what I'm going to read to you now, what we see on the screen, is Maharishi's preferred definition of Vastu or Sthapatya as he reconstructed it. And he spent about 20 years, 20 years, very focused on restoring the system to have the effects that are described in the Vedic literature, because in his survey of the other system, of the various systems of Vastu or Sthapatya as they survive in different traditions in different parts of India, he found a lot of valuable knowledge, but he did not find a complete and holistic practice that would deliver all of the effects described in the Vedic literature. And so he worked very deeply with the architects from these ancient lineages to restore the practice to fully deliver what it proposes to deliver. And he then defined it as we read on the screen. Maharishi Sthapatya, or we can say Maharishi Vastu architecture, is the most complete and ancient system of architecture and planning according to the solar lunar, and planetary influences on the Earth, and with reference to the North Pole, South Pole, and equator, connecting individual life with cosmic life and individual intelligence with cosmic intelligence. Well, this is a very heady definition, which I had to read many times before I felt I partially understood. And so we're going to actually unpack this sentence over the course of the next half hour. How do we design a house in accord with the solar influences on the Earth and with reference to the North and South Pole and equator so as to connect our intelligence with the intelligence that organizes the cosmos? That's what I have to demonstrate to you. That's the question. Well, there are 4 cardinal directions on planet Earth: north, south, east, and west, but one of them is the primal direction, the basic direction. And what direction is that? Well, it's east, not north. And why is east the primal direction? Because, as you can see on the screen, the Earth is a sphere that rotates on its axis. The axis passes through the North and South Pole, and the surface of the Earth rotates from west to east, which means that our direction of travel for our entire lives is to the east. And at this latitude, it's about 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers to the east. We are moving very rapidly to the east for our entire lives. That's why it's the primal direction. And it is because of this basic reality of the nature of planet Earth that the sun rises in the east. Because the Earth is rotating to the east, the sun has no choice. In fact, every object in the universe, all of the celestial bodies, have to pass overhead from east to west. Doesn't matter what they are doing themselves, because the Earth is spinning so fast to the east. What we experience on the surface of planet Earth is the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets passing overhead from east to west. Now, everything on the surface of planet Earth is as it is, directly or indirectly, because of the various influences of the sun and its energy. Nothing would be as it is without that. So we can say that the primary influences of natural law, the sun, etc., the primary influences of natural law come at us from the east, okay? And it is the rotation of the Earth which causes the sun, moon, and planets and stars to approach the Earth from the east. And that's why we can say that the sun, as well as every other cosmic influence, comes at us from the east as the surface of the Earth rotates to the east. So when we face east, we are facing natural law. Now, the Vedic texts propose that when we face natural law, we are aligning ourselves with nature, with the flow of nature. We function more in harmony with nature, okay? For the unity of nature to become a real thing, the first step has to do with this Eastern orientation, aligning ourselves with the cosmic forces of nature. And this has just been measured for the first time. Amazingly, what we are seeing is Professor Fred Travis, professor of psychology at Maharishi University, a very, very deeply, extensively published professor who is at this point in this photograph placed an EEG cap, a cap with EEG leads on it, on the head of a subject. Those leads are connected to that stack of equipment behind him. And with that, he is able to monitor the electrical activity at the surface of the brain, which is to say the prefrontal cortex, or the chief executive of the brain. Now, this is a rather crowded, complicated chart, but he has just done the following. And this is something he's done very recently. It has been submitted for publication in a peer review magazine. It has not gone through peer review yet. And so we should consider this piece of research to be something that is not yet remotely official, but we'll just have a light look at it because what he has found is so interesting. Now, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 groups of bars. And each of those groups is measuring brain activity at different frequencies. The key ones are on the far right, circled with that black rectangle, okay? And he had subjects engaged in focused activity, specifically working on a jigsaw puzzle, facing each of 4 different directions, north, south, east, and west. And as they were doing that, he was measuring coherence of the brain. Now, the significance of coherence I will get to in a minute. But looking on those far right groups of lines, which are the key ones, what we see is a black bar, and then a gray bar, and then a dark gray bar, and then a diagonally slash bar, okay? Now those refer to the direction that the subject is facing. The black bar represents subjects who are facing east. The light gray bar represents subjects who are facing north. The dark gray bar represents subjects who are facing west. And the diagonal line bar represents subjects who are facing east. So if you can see my cursor, this is east, north, west, and south. And I think I didn't describe it correctly just now, but east, north, west, and south. And again, east, north, west, and south. And what we are finding, what the graph is revealing, is that how coherent a person's brain is differs when they're facing different directions. What we're seeing is their brains in these key ranges are most coherent when the subject is facing east, a little less coherent when facing north, a little less coherent when facing west, and least coherent when facing south. And the total difference between south and east is, I think I calculated about 20%. It's quite a significant difference between the two. Now, what is the significance in coherence, which is what the chart is measuring? EEG coherence, as this chart shows, correlates with a whole series of traits. Established published research has established that greater EEG coherence is correlated with increased creativity, increased IQ, increased moral reasoning and grade point average in school, and is inversely correlated with neuroticism. That is, it is correlated with improved mental health. And so what we seem to be seeing is that these traits, these desirable traits, are likely to be greater. I think this is something that we can speculate from this data, are likely to be greater in people who are facing east, a little less in people facing north, a little less in people facing west, and least in people facing south. Now, it just so happens that these are precisely the recommendations for human orientation recommended in Maharishi Vastu and in the ancient Vedic literature. And therefore, when we design Maharishi Vastu buildings, we design them to ensure that we face east or north for primary activities. In Vastu offices, as in this photograph, we face east or north, which is the case of every desk that we can see in this photo in a Maharishi Vastu building. And what is the activity that we spend the greatest amount of time doing facing in a single direction? Well, it's sleep, of course. And published research, now, this is an interesting thing. The data on lying down with eyes closed is different than the data on people upright and engaged in active activity with the eyes open. What Vastu recommends and what Professor Travis's research is suggesting is that when we're lying down with the eyes closed, when we are resting, that we have the most coherence when facing east, and then the second most when the head is to the south. And that would mean the headboard is to the east, and the headboard is to south, and less when the headboard is to the west, and least when the headboard is to the north. In other words, it's kind of starting with east, it moves in the opposite direction than when we're upright with eyes open. And this correlates with research that we can see on the screen, which published in a peer review magazine, that people who sleep with heads to the north, that is headboard on the north side, also score the worst on a mental health exam. And an unpublished follow-up study also indicates that people who sleep with head to the east score the best. So this idea in Vastu and Stapatya that the direction we face for major activities when we're awake or when we're sleeping are real things. And every Maharishi Vastu house or apartment or office is designed, in the case of a house, so that all the beds can have the headboard to the east or to the south, improving our mental health. And this comes from the rotation of the earth causing the sun to pass overhead from east to west. And so if we go back to this definition that Maharishi Stapatya, Maharishi Vastu, is according to the solar influences on the earth now and connecting individual intelligence with cosmic intelligence, we start to see what that sentence is about. That it is a real thing to be able to design a house in accord with the solar influences on Earth and with reference to the poles. We'll talk about the poles in a minute. So as to connect our intelligence with cosmic intelligence, and we start to understand the causes of the effects of living in Vastu. Why don't we stop at this point? And Susan, you can check to see whether there are any questions that have come in which pertain to this subject of human orientation.
There are questions, John. They don't particularly pertain to this aspect of orientation.
Well, we will come later to building orientation. And so if they pertain to that, we could hold on them.
Yes, I think that's a good idea at this point.
All right. Okay. The next principle is that there's a healthful influence that comes at us from the east around the time of sunrise. This is a principle in the ancient Vedic culture, and it's a principle which is identified in many cultures around the world. When we live indoors, how might we take advantage of this influence? Well, we elongate a building so that its longest sides face east and west, as we see in this photo of a Maharishi Vastu office building. And we make sure that we have lots of windows on the east side. By the way, a study of the employees of a new tenant in this building, which is the Tower Oaks building in suburban Washington, D.C., the largest Maharishi Vastu building built in the United States so far. A study of the employees of a new tenant in this building has just been accepted for publication in the Journal of Creativity after going through peer review. And we look forward to reading all about it. I know that the author of the study has been objectively documenting how their levels of creativity changed when they moved from another building into this Maharishi Vastu building. This is my own house. And this is simply an example of a house in which we get lots of east light. I actually designed a long, skinny house facing east such that every room in the house has an east window so that the entire house would have this benefit of the influence from the east at the time of sunrise. And that may account in part for why it has such a charming effect upon me. So now we want to ask, has this effect, the effect of east light, ever been measured? Well, there has been no research on this subject done specifically to illuminate Vastu. But when I did a literature review, I found 3 studies, each published in good medical journals, each of which were comparing health outcomes for subjects who were exposed to east light versus west light. Let's have a look at the results of those studies. This first study, footnote below, demonstrates that subjects who were admitted to a hospital with symptoms of bipolar disorder were released from treatment 3.4 days sooner than if they had been checked into a hospital room on the east side of the corridor, that is with an east window, compared to patients who were checked into the same wing of that hospital, but into rooms on the west side of that corridor, that is with a west window. And the average length of stay was something like 20 days. So reducing length of stay by 3.4 days, it's pretty wonderful. In the second study, which was done by a Nobel laureate and published in PLOS, the conclusion of the lead researcher, this Nobel laureate, was that in order to reduce our likelihood of developing skin cancer, we should do our best to be exposed to sunlight in the morning and avoid it in the afternoon. And finally, I'm sorry, this is the study that was published in PLOS. The last one was published by Northwestern University, and I'm not sure of the journal because I can't read the citations right now, but you could. But in this study, the conclusion was that subjects who are exposed primarily to east light have more ideal body weight than subjects who are exposed to west light, sunlight. And therefore, we have some confirmation, we can call it preliminary confirmation, from medical research that there is some value to our health to have east windows. And by the way, for the record, these are the only studies that I found that are looking at the effects of sunlight from different directions. I found no studies that looked at the effects of north light or south light. At this point, do we have any questions on these subjects up to that we've talked about so far?
Yes, I think we do actually, John. One question that just came in actually, is there any research on both people following Vastu and not following Vastu staying in Maharishi Vastu homes? Does their psychology and thought make a difference if of the Vastu effect on them? I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think you probably can get an answer for that.
It's very challenging to conduct ideal medical research or statistical studies on people living in Vastu because they know they're in Vastu inevitably, and therefore their outcomes, their experiences may be biased by what they have heard about Vastu. This is the placebo effect, and gold standard research is able to largely or completely eliminate the placebo effect in the experimental models. And it's really a challenge to do that because if you live in a Vastu home that you had built, you certainly know you're in Vastu and you know what the effect is supposed to be. But there are two ways of getting at it somewhat. The first way is simply by surveying lots and lots of people who live in Vastu and see whether any really statistically strong result comes out. And the answer is that that's been done, and we're going to look at that in a few minutes. So I'll save those results for that. But there's another way that this research could be done. And we have a plan to do that research in a few years because a large developer is in the process of developing some large apartment buildings, each with something like 200 units in them. And he plans that one of those apartment buildings will be a Maharishi Vastu building. The others will not. These buildings are all adjacent to each other, and they are being built in a short window of time. Now, because the units are for rent, it can easily be arranged that when that Vastu apartment building is completed with 200 units, that the tenants are not informed that they're moving into Vastu. And so our hope, our intention is to work with a major educational institution located in a large city where these apartment buildings are being built to do before and after surveys, or at least after surveys, of people who move into the Maharishi Vastu apartment building versus the non-Maharishi Vastu buildings adjacent, built at about the same time in very similar styles. And perhaps in some cases also to be able to do some actual medical readings on those subjects. And so that, I think, will hit the gold standard, if it's constructed properly, of giving us a direct answer to this very good question. So I'm just waiting somewhat impatiently for that building to be built so that we can do that research.
Jon, I just wanted to add that we have had at least a good amount of anecdotal reports, either from people who had Vastu houses and for one reason or other had to leave them for some time and then, you know, rent out the house to people who had no prior experience or even knowledge of Maharishi Vastu, and what their, you know, overwhelming, you know, positive effect and acknowledgement of the value of being in the house was. We also have, you know, on a regular basis, there is here in Iowa, there is a bed and breakfast that is a Maharishi Vastu home, and people from, you know, all over come and stay there on a regular but short-term basis and leave comments behind in the guest book about how, you know, wonderful the, you know, their stay was, how they slept better, how they enjoyed being in the building, and those kinds of things. So it is anecdotal, that is true, but, and these were people also who knew absolutely nothing about the speciality of the house.
Beautiful. Anecdotal evidence is the first step in scientific research. It helps us to identify whether there may be reason to think that there is a phenomenon worth studying. And as you said, the anecdotal evidence, including among people who are unfamiliar with Vastu, who have spent some time in Vastu buildings, is quite overwhelming. And we will share with you in some detail one anecdote at the end of this talk. So let's go on to the next section. If one knows anything at all about Vastu, about Sthapatya, what one knows is that we believe that the direction that buildings face has a dramatic effect upon the quality of life lived in the building. Well, it sounds to most people like utter superstition, completely improbable. And we'll look at the statistical evidence in just a second. But before we do that, there's a lot of information on this chart, so you're probably staring at your screen. Go ahead and take a screenshot if you want, so you can look at it later. What you are seeing is in the notes that a house that faces east has an influence of enlightenment, and fulfillment, and that a house that faces north, that would be at the top, also with a yellow arrow, has an influence of prosperity and happiness. A house facing northeast has a lesser influence of success on the outside, and the other directions all have various negative influences we don't really want to pay too much attention to. But noteworthy is that a house that faces south has all negative influences. The effect of living in a south-facing house, we understand from the ancient Vedic literature, is problems and suffering. So, is this real? Because it's something which has been so unexamined by Western science and so out of the realm of our day-to-day conversations for most people that it seems very unlikely. So what's the research? There have been 4 research projects done to date, 3 of them published in good peer-reviewed medical journals. Each of these 4 studies has looked at the effects upon some objective measurement of quality of life of people, non-meditators, and in almost all cases, not living in Fairfield, Iowa, and correlating them with the directions that the houses face. And the cliff notes is that in every case, in each of these 4 studies, which we're about to look at, subjects who live in south-facing houses have significantly worse outcomes. So let's look at the first one. In a paper published in the Journal of Social Behavior and Personality, it was established by administering mental health exams to subjects in another city, not in Fairfield, that those who live in south-facing houses have worse mental health, scored worse on the mental health exam. The second study, unpublished, but it was based upon an analysis of the records of 100 patients, and 100 patients makes this a pretty darn statistically significant outcome, because what the researcher found, a cardiologist, is that 50%, not 25%, but 50% of his patients live in south-facing houses. And he established that in the area from which his patients come, houses face equally in the 4 directions. 50% more likely to be under the care of a cardiologist, meaning that one has a heart problem. And third, in a published peer-reviewed study, subjects who were given a questionnaire eliciting how prosperous they find themselves to be, it was found that those who live in south-facing houses describe themselves as least likely to be prospering. Finally, and most shockingly, even the incidence of burglaries is dramatically south-facing houses. Now, this piece of research was done in Fairfield, Iowa, so there might be a placebo effect, but the people who break into houses are probably not meditators. So probably there isn't a placebo effect. And this research was done simply by reviewing the police department's records for 1 year. So we see that, there's maybe 70% greater level of burglaries in south-facing houses than in the houses facing the other directions. So in conclusion, I think I actually calculated 75% more burglaries in south-facing houses. So it is clear that for the best results, our homes and apartment buildings should be oriented not to the south. And we recommend in Vastu, as I think will come out in further research, that they should be oriented ideally to the east or to the north. The east is the direction of the rising sun, and that is ideal. Now, it may sound like I'm describing a set of rules. Sleep facing this way, have the house face that way, make sure that plenty of light comes in through these windows. But Vastu is not a set of rules. It is an integrated force of nature. And why can I claim that? Of course, the Vedic literature is very clear on that, and it gives us a very profound understanding that we are simply using nature's own organizing intelligence that is used in the organization of all of the structures of nature. But we get a clue that this is not just a set of isolated rules when we look at multiple factors. And in a piece of research that was just a pilot study, not published, and so we don't want to lend too much credence to this, but we are working with a researcher to follow up on this on a large scale. 30 companies were analyzed. Each company was small enough that it was located in a single building, and each company was publicly traded so that the researchers could obtain from public records 5 years of annual statements from which they could extract how many dollars of, I think it was profit per employee that the companies have been earning. And this is a measurement of, we could say, the financial efficiency of the human capital of the companies. A great single item measurement of success of a company. And by looking at aerial photographs, an associate of mine, a Maharishi Vastu architect, was able to establish what direction the buildings faced, what their shapes are, which is another Vastu factor, and whether they had, if they have a fence around them, as they did, what direction the gate is, which is another Vastu element, and then other Vastu elements in the environment, where in what direction there is a hill, in what direction is the nearest water body, because we also understand the influences of these. So she scored each of the 30 companies for these 5 factors, and then ranked them into groups of should be very successful, pretty successful, average, below average, or poorly successful. And based on the 5 years of financial statements, an independent researcher also grouped the companies into 5 categories of actual success. And then they compared their lists. And what they discovered is that my associate, the Vastu architect, had correctly predicted the approximate degree of financial success of 27 out of the 30 companies. Now, even though this is only a pilot study and only 30 subjects, to get 27 out of 30 right is pretty overwhelming. And so we can be very optimistic that when a study such as this is done on a larger scale, we may have a real statistically significant validation of the effect of the integration of multiple Vastu effects. But even that is still measuring only 5 factors. And I've said that this is a real force of nature, and it is a real integrated, holistic system. So what might be the effects of the real thing, of living in actual Maharishi Vastu buildings? Well, now we get to the answer to that earlier question. Remember, the predictions from the ancient literature is that the results will be to promote good health, happiness, family harmony, success, and growth to enlightenment. How can we measure these things? Well, the answer is that we have done, not we, but an independent researcher, a widely published PhD, composed a survey which was then sent to as many of our clients around the world as we could get current email addresses for. It was sent out to somewhere between 400 and 500 clients. We have many more, but these were the current email addresses. And responses came back from right around 150. And so now, what were the results? Were there any results that might give us an inkling into the impact of living in Maharishi Vastu on our health? And the answer is that one of the questions in the survey asked whether people attribute an improvement in health to living in Vastu. And that bar on the far left with the pink arrow shows that 80% of the respondents to the survey said yes, they agree that their mental health has improved from living in Vastu. How about physical health? Well, 70% report improved physical health. Now, the next subject that we have, that the literature predicts, is that there will be an increase in happiness, or an influence for greater happiness. Well, one of the questions was to ask whether the subject's children are happier since they have lived in Vastu. And the answer is that 88% of parents said yes, they find them to be happier. The next subject predicted is family harmony. And one of the questions in the survey asked, are your family relations better or worse since living in Vastu? And 77% of the respondents, 143 respondents, reported improvements, strongly agreed that family relations have improved since living in Vastu. The Vedic literature also predicts that there's an influence promoting success. So we asked, or the researcher asked in this survey, whether there is any correlation with you living in Vastu and your success, and 92% of the respondents reported greater overall success. Finally, the fifth quality is growth to enlightenment. And how can this be measured? Well, there are a couple of questions that can be asked, the answers to which probably have some real correlation to whether enlightenment is growing in our lives. And indeed, one question that was asked in the questionnaire was, do you have less stress in your life since living in Vastu? And the answer was that 85% of the respondents said, yes, we have less stress in our life since living in Vastu. And the other measurement of growth towards enlightenment was that 82% report increased fulfillment of goals in their lives since living in Vastu, and 90% report improved overall quality of life. So between these three survey questions, I think that we see a suggestion of a growth towards enlightenment among people who live in Vastu. Now, this is not an ideal survey. There was no control group, and it has not been published yet. And so we cannot take the results of the survey as statistical or mathematical proof of the effect of living in Vastu. But this is the research that's been done to date. And I think it is very interesting and really quite illuminating. And it helps us to understand the basis of the effects of living in Vastu, which is our subject today. So at this point, I think I will stop again and ask whether we have any questions on the subjects we've discussed so far. Susan?
Yes, John, we have quite a number of questions. Let me just look at a couple that came in from people who are attending with us. Excuse me, it just takes me a minute to. This one is about facing the house and whether the principles that you've been enumerating actually apply in all geographic conditions and even in different climatic conditions.
Yes.
Okay, so the answer to that is yes.
Yes, and I'll elaborate just slightly. It is not the case. Well, the underlying question might be, if I live in the southern hemisphere at a certain time of the day, sunlight is coming in through a northeasterly window, but if I'm in the northern hemisphere at the same time of day, sunlight is coming in through a southeasterly window, for an example. And I did not say last time, and I do not mean to imply to you, that the placement influences, which we actually haven't talked about yet today, have specifically to do with what direction or what window the light is coming in through. They have to do rather with the cosmic influence of the sun, which changes over the course of the day. So all of the other influences, certainly, as well, are the same everywhere on the globe. Maybe not on the North or South Pole, but none of us build in such a location, because the sun rises in the east everywhere on planet Earth, and the Earth rotates from west to east everywhere on the Earth. And the North Pole is to the north, and the South Pole is to the south. And it is these cosmic regulators of the geography of this planet which are being utilized, and they do not vary.
Okay, I have two questions actually, dealing with large buildings or some other something else, casting a shadow on the eastern portion of a home, of a home, and if that, if building of Vastu should still be to the east, if there is a huge building casting a shadow in the eastern end.
That's a very good question, and we look forward to the day coming where we are building lots of buildings in dense urban locations where there are large buildings, and this question is really germane. Right now, it's sadly just hypothetical, but I can still answer it. And the answer is that sunlight still comes to us from the east early in the morning, even if there's a building to the east of us, unlike if there is a large hill directly to the east of us, because it will completely block that eastern influence, but a building to the east will not. So we are not concerned about that.
Okay, and a question that came in actually before the webinar also mentioned that you said in the previous webinar that a hill to the east is not optimal. Does the same hold true for trees to the east that would block or filter the rising sun from the house? In other words, should there be a clear view of the sun and its changing course through the day from the various rooms?
There's a particular distance that we would like to hold trees back from the house. And we'll go into the details with any individual when we look at their sites in Google Earth. We can see tree cover around the site, and we can go into the particulars for them. In the general case, we are not concerned about a forest to the east of a building. We wouldn't want to put the house smack in the middle of the forest with the trees coming right up close to the house, a dense forest. But the way that we more commonly would build with a forest nearby is something which is completely acceptable.
Do you have more, John, or can I ask a few more questions, actually?
There is more in the presentation, but by all means, ask some more questions.
Okay, here's a good one, I think, actually. You mentioned in your first talk that a stick and string measurement for true east can be quite accurate. Would you please describe that method? And then from another submission, someone said how to locate the exact east without using the traditional Vastu measurement with circle and pole.
Mm-hmm. So the the ancient systems we have very precisely described in an email, and any of you who are planning to build Maharishi Vastu homes, that is one of the pieces of information that we will supply to you. So it can satisfy your intellectual curiosity, And so that you can actually do this on your site, as anyone can do. And it will also connect you, by doing this, it will connect you to the cosmic and solar laws of nature right there on the site where you're going to build. But very, very briefly, what I can say is that if you erect a stake in the ground, and it's carefully quite vertical, it casts a shadow during the day. And if you draw a circle around it, with it at the center of the circle, which you can do with a string, and the circle is of the proper diameter, then what you will find is that the shadow will cross the circle at a certain point in the morning and at a certain point late in the day. And if you mark those 2 points on the circle and then draw a straight line connecting them, you will have drawn a line which is running due north-south. There is actually a slight additional step which makes the process more precise than what I described, but I won't go into that right now. I think anyone can visualize that by doing what I have just described. We'll give them a line which is almost precisely due north-south, and we can make an adjustment to it to make it perfect. And based on that, surveyors have, using the best laser equipment and GPS equipment, have found true east on a site and compared it to what can be found with a stick and a string. And the results differed by a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a degree, basically within the degree of tolerance of any surveyor's work. So this traditional method is astonishingly accurate. Now, how do surveyors typically find true east today? Well, most surveyors today use differential GPS. They have, they're reading signals from multiple satellites, and if they get signals from 10 or 15 GPS satellites, and they check a database that gives for some slight atmospheric alterations that occur hour by hour, they are, from those signals, able to tell precisely, very, very precisely, any direction that they are pointing their transit in. So that's a short, non-technical description of how surveyors do it. And we have, again, a memo that we will supply to you when you're building your Maharishi Vastu home, that you will simply give to your surveyor, and it describes to them in their own language what our standard is and what the references are for due north and due east in the language that they understand.
Okay, here's someone who also just sent in a question. I get the importance of light from the east, but why the emphasis on the front door and an exact east as opposed to approximate east?
In addition to the rotation of the earth, there, we can say that the passage of the sun overhead from east to west maybe traces some lines reflecting that passage. And they're parallel lines that run from east to west on the surface of the globe, as in the large picture of the globe. What we see in the little inset illustration upper left is that, and let me get another view. Okay.
That's good.
Yeah. If we were to connect the North Pole and South Pole on the surface of the globe, we would be tracing lines that run north-south. They're kind of pie slices, but at any single point on the globe, they appear to run, they do run true north-south. And these lines, east, west, and north-south, form a grid on the surface of the globe, which is just like the grid of latitude and longitude that we see on any globe. And so the lines of latitude and longitude form squares or rectangles that are perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions at the smaller scale of a city or a building anywhere on the globe. Now, what these lines represent, based on what I've just described, is the cosmic forces on the surface of the Earth. They represent the passage of the sun overhead from east to west and the connection between the North Pole and the South Pole. And so, in fact, quantum physics has identified an identical quantum mechanical field on the surface of any spinning, rotating celestial body like planet Earth that looks just like this, but at a quantum mechanical level. And so we can say that it is a real thing, that there is a grid on the surface of the Earth that reflects the nature of the. If we erect some structure on the surface of planet Earth, a building, we can choose to erect it so that it is aligned with this grid, that its walls run in the cardinal directions precisely, or not. And we can think that if they are not aligned with the cardinal directions, we can visualize that there might be some kind of localized interference pattern caused by the building proximate to it, which might explain why criminal activity is higher in south-facing buildings, but that's another subject. So this helps us to understand the answer to that question that was asked earlier about why we try to lay out buildings very precisely to the cardinal directions. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And now, this is why when we look at Maharishi Vastu communities, and we're going to look at an aerial view of the largest community in North America so far, North Campus Village, which will soon have 180 Maharishi Vastu units of housing in it. We find that the houses are laid out according to the grid, and the roads run due north, south, and east, west. And in a smaller, early, but very charming Maharishi Vastu village, which is Mandala One Village in Maharishi Vedic City, which I lived in for some time and really loved. I found that life is very pleasant, very coherent because of the effect of the grid. And I could spend more time, but maybe we'll do a conference call on Vastu communities. I'm going to end with a single anecdote, as I promised. One family story. This is a story about a physician. He is an oncologist in California. He was a TM meditator, and so he contacted me about 20 years ago saying that he was going to build his own oncology clinic, a blood and cancer center. And did I think that we could integrate the principles of Maharishi Vastu into this building? Well, we discussed it and we decided that we certainly could. We'd see what the effects were. So we worked with his local medical physician and built this blood and cancer center. It has been so successful that they've expanded it 3 times, and it's now the largest blood and cancer center that's not connected to a hospital, I understand, in the western half of the United States. So it's been very successful. But I spoke to him, to the owner, the founder, a few months, maybe half a year after they first moved into the building. And I said, so what's new? And he said, well, since we moved into this building, my belief, my observation is that we're getting better outcomes among our patients. But he's a hard-nosed, frequently published medical researcher, and there was no double-blind study here. So he wasn't going to make that as a public claim, but that was his own observation looking at the statistics, that patients were recovering better. Second, he said to me that his personnel were happier, that he had less turnover. That was a very good thing for business and very good for his employees. But then he said there was a third thing that he had noticed, and that is that when people come to cancer centers for treatment, they're being poisoned. They are being poisoned with either chemo or radiation. And at this time, particularly 20 years ago, when treatments were not quite as targeted, it was very common that people who would go through several rounds of treatments would get nauseous every time. And eventually, after several treatments, their body would figure out that when I go to that place of treatment, I get nauseated. And viscerally, in their gut, not intellectually, people would be repelled from going to the place of treatment. So what he said to me is, what we have found is that since we have moved into this building, our patients are dropping by for visits. And that to him was the most significant thing. So they expanded it, as I said, and have many very happy employees now. But he and his wife, who was also an oncologist, when they would go home at the end of the day, would go home to non-Vastu. And so one day I got a call from him and he said, we want to live in Vastu as well. And so we worked with his local residential architect and we designed a Maharishi Vastu house. Really, his architect did, we consulted on the Vastu elements. And again, about a half a year later, I called him up and I said, so what's new? And he said, well, we have one child, our son, he at that time was 10 years old. And our client said that our son has always gotten scared after going to bed and always would end up in our bedroom, in our bed, eventually, every night. And when a child does this when they're 3 or 4 or 5 years old, it's not too concerning to parents, maybe inconvenient, but nothing of great concern. But if a child is still unable to sleep on their own at age 10, then the parents are quite concerned about the fear in the heart of their child. So what our client said to me is that after they moved into the Maharishi Vastu house, that very first night, their son spent, for the first time in his life, the full night peacefully in his own bed, in his own bedroom, and every night thereafter. So our clients felt that living in this house had removed that fear from the heart of their child, which was so concerning to them. So this is a single anecdote about one family. No scientific conclusions can be drawn from it, but this is still a real and a personal thing, and it helps us to understand the reality of it by hearing some anecdotes.
Thank you all for joining us. We really do, from our side, enjoy giving these webinars. And I can see, because I had many questions that had come in that we hadn't gotten around to answering. I think, John, we're going to have to do a webinar just about for questions.
Beautiful. We'll do that.